Hey everyone, my name is Jeremy McPeak and welcome to this fourth lesson of ASP .NET from Scratch. In this lesson I had originally planned for us to look at data. We were going to look at Microsoft SQL Server and we were going to look at ADO.NET. But with the release of MVC 2 a couple of weeks ago and with .NET 4 being released within a few weeks, I decided it would probably be best to move forward as fast as possible to get to MVC and so that we can look at some new features of .NET 4 whenever it's released. So we're not going to spend a lot of time with data. We are still going to look briefly at SQL Server, but we're going to spend our time with template controls and how we can use them and data bind with them. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to open up SQL Server Management Studio. I had to download this separately. Microsoft SQL Server 2008 Express was installed whenever we installed Visual Web Developer Express in the first lesson, but I had to download and install Management Studio. It is a free application by Microsoft, so all you have to do is do a search for it in Google or Bing or whatever and download it and install it. I am connecting to the instance, which is SQL Express here, on the machine that this operating system is running on, which is VM-ASP.NET. This is a virtual machine, but everything will work fine. I'm using Windows authentication instead of the SQL Server authentication. If I were going to use the built-in SQL Server authentication, then I would use a username and a password. But Windows authentication is just so much easier, especially when developing. You don't have to worry about user credentials or anything like that until you're ready to do so. So with Windows authentication, it actually looks at the user that I'm logged into Windows with, and it determines what privileges I have in SQL Server based on the privileges that I have in Windows. I'm set up as an administrator, so I will have all of the administrative goodies within SQL Server. Over on the left hand side here is an interface kind of like Windows Explorer. It has a bunch of folders and a bunch of plus signs and all that wonderful stuff. So under databases, if we had a database, a user-created database, it would be listed here, but right now all we have are the system databases, and if we go in there we can see the 4 system databases that you do not want to touch unless if you know exactly what you're doing. Otherwise you can really mess up SQL Server and it wouldn't even run. So we're going to leave those alone. There's also security. Under logins, we can see all the users that can log in to Management Studio here, or that can access any of the databases. The user that I'm using right now is this McPeak/ASP.NET from Scratch. These users with a red arrow are disabled. SA is super admin, and this is a SQL Server user. It is independent from Windows. But if we wanted to enable it, we could go to the status and then we could click on the enabled and then click OK. But we're going to leave everything as it is right now. We could also create some server roles and assign users to these particular roles if we wanted to, but we're going to leave that alone. We primarily want to create a database, add a table, and then add some data to that table. So I'm going to right click on databases and choose new database. I'm going to type in the name of the new database. It's going to be lesson 4. We could set a variety of options if we wanted to. We could also set the compatibility level, which is really nice if we're dealing with other SQL servers as well. If you're working in an organization that may have a server running 2000 and then another server running 2005, and if you need to create a database that can work on either of those systems, then you can do that here. But we're going to leave everything as 2008 and click OK. And we can see that our new database is listed here under databases, and by expanding it we can see all of the stuff that we can use to manage here. Under database diagrams, if we had tables, we could make a diagram of all the tables, but we don't have a table yet. Under tables, they would be listed here. If we wanted to create any views, we could do that here. Under programmability, we have stored procedures and functions and triggers. So we have a lot of options available to us that we could administer this database with. Right now I'm going to create a table. I'm going to right click and choose New Table, and it's going to pull up the table designer. This first column I'm going to call ID. I was taught that every table should have a unique identifier for every record. For the data type, I'm choosing an integer, but you could also choose the unique identifier if you wanted to. The int is just a lot easier to work with, especially if you're having to work with a lot of data. It just makes things a lot simpler. The second column is going to be called first name. Its data type is going to be an varchar. It's going to have a length of 25, and it's not going to allow any nulls. The next column is going to be last name. It too is going to be an varchar, and it is going to have a length of 25. Now down here at the bottom is the column properties. Whatever column that we have selected here, we'll see the properties change for that particular column. And since this is the identity of this table, I want to set it as the primary key, and I want to set the identity specification to yes. And what this does, the identity seed means that it's going to start at 1, and it will auto increment by 1. So we'll have records with IDs of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and on to infinity. Well, on to however big the int data type is. Over on the right here we have a property sheet for the table. I'm going to hit Control Save to save this table. I'm going to call it names, and we can see it listed over here after it's been saved. We can look at the columns, which are listed here. PK stands for primary key because we did set that here, and then we can see the data type and whether or not it allows nulls. The keys listed here are the primary key. If we had any foreign keys, they would be listed here as well. If we wanted to add some indexes, we could do that as well. Right now, we're just going to leave it with the primary key. So now that we have a table, we want to add some data to it. I'm going to close the designer, and I'm going to right click on this table, and we can see that we can select the top 1,000 rows, or we can edit the top 200 rows, and that's what we want to do. So we'll click that, and it'll pull up kind of a designer interface. What we'll do is we'll just type into these fields. We don't have to worry about the ID because it will add an identification number here. So the first name, we're going to do Billy Johnson, Billy Bob, and Billie Jean is not my lover. So we have 4 names here, and we have data within our database now. So if we wanted to, we could go and we could select the top 1,000 rows. It'll pull up a query window for us to type queries into if we wanted to, and we will see the results of that query down here. We could also right click on the database here, and we can choose new query. Then we could type in a query. And there is IntelliSense with Management Studio 2008. There is not IntelliSense with 2005. So if you want all the latest goodies, you'll want to download 2008. And then to run this query, we can either click on this execute, or we can just hit F5, and we'll see the results of this query here. So we have everything that we want. No, I do not want to save this query, and we'll just exit Management Studio. And then we will get started with Visual Web Developer Express. I'm going to create a new project, so I'm going to go to File and the New Project. I'm going to make sure that ASP.NET Web Application is selected, and I'm going to call this project Template Controls. And before I can do anything, I need to go over to the Database Explorer because we're going to add a connection to the database that we just created so that we can use it to data bind to a control and display that data. I'm going to right click on data connections and choose add connection, and it's going to pull up this window here, this add connection. We need to know the server name. If we just pull down on this drop down, it's going to go out and look at every computer on the network and find the computers that are running SQL Server. I have 3 here on my network. The one that we're interested in is this last one. We are going to use Windows authentication, and then we need to enter the database that we want to connect to, and that is lesson 4. We don't really need to test this connection because we wouldn't even get this far if there was some type of network error or if there were some authentication errors. We wouldn't even see this list of databases to choose from. So I'm just going to click OK, and we can see something similar to what we saw in Management Studio. We can still go in, we can add a new table. We can also view the data within the table. And we could also add some stored procedures or some functions. The only thing here is this is a little bit more limited as to what we can do with the database. We can create tables, but we can't really create relationships between tables. So if you're going to do anything with SQL Server or with a database, I recommend that you use Management Studio as opposed to the tools here within the Database Explorer. It's great to doing some simple tasks, but if you need to do anything more advanced, Management Studio is where you need to go. So we now have a data connection. I'm going to close this start page, and I'll go back to the Solution Explorer. I'm going to right click on the project, and I'm going to add a new item. This is going to be a link to SQL classes. I'm going to call this lesson 4, and it automatically added the references that we needed, which was the system.data.link. And we have another designer here. We'll go back to our Database Explorer, we'll go to the tables, and we'll just drag and drop the names on it. And what this is doing, this is actually creating some classes for us. This is going to be a name class. It's going to have these properties. We can click on each of these properties and we can see all types of information about this property. We could even change these if we wanted to, but we're going to leave this as is, just because it is mapping to each individual record within our database table. So this every name object is going to be a record within the names database. This data context here, lesson 4 data context, is kind of going to be our interface to the database. And we can look at the code that this generates. We can go to this designer.cs, and this is all of the C# code that it is generating from this designer. So we can see that we have the data context class, and then we have the name class, and then we can look at all the properties and methods that are a part of these two classes. But this is a really handy way to get a quick and easy data access layer up and running. If you need something more advanced, the Entity Framework is a nice tool to use, or you can use ADO.NET if you wanted to get real nitty-gritty. To test to make sure that everything's working as far as our data context is concerned, I'm going to go to default.aspx.cs, and I'm going to create a new data context object. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a for each loop to loop over every name object within db.names. And what this actually does is this maps to our names table within the database. So this is going to loop through every record because we haven't specified any criteria here. It's just going to pull every name from that names table. And all I really want to do is just display some text so that we can make sure that everything as far as our connection is working all right. And so I'm going to write out the last name in every record, and then I'm going to separate them with a breaking element. So I'll just hit F5, and we can see that the last names are there. So everything as far as our data connection is working okay. So now we can go to our markup file. I'm going to get rid of that loop. And we can add a repeater control. Now, repeater control is kind of the most flexible of the template and data bound controls. Data binding means that we take a data source and we bind it to a particular control. Instead of having to write a loop to loop over every item within that data source, the data bound control does that for us. And since the repeater control is a template control, we can also determine how that control displays that data. So we can supply it with some HTML markup, we can supply it with some special syntax to determine how we show the information from the database, and it'll generate the HTML for us. So we don't really have to write a whole lot of code, we just have to set the templates, set the data source, tell it to bind to that data source, and it'll do the rest of the work for us. Data bound and template controls are really great for rapid application development. If you need to get an application out quickly and you need to just display some data, the repeater control and other data bound and template controls are really great for that, but you lose some flexibility. With the repeater control, it's the most flexible of all of those types of controls, so we haven't really lost a whole lot of anything. But looping through the data source yourself and generating the HTML yourself is typically going to be the best way if you want the most customizability and if you have some special criteria that your application needs to meet. But if you just need to get an application out, data binding and using a template control is great for that. So I'm going to add a repeater control. I'm going to give it an ID of RPT, short for repeater, and then names. Then I'm going to set the run at attribute. And we can tell that IntelliSense is showing us 5 templates that we can choose from. There are header and footer, item, and then alternating item templates, and then a separator template. If you're familiar with reports like from Access or some other type of database platform that allows you to write reports, most reports have a header, a footer, and a detail. Well, the header and footer are the header and footer of a report. It generates what we put at the top and at the bottom of the items. The item and alternating item templates are the detail. Every item within our data source is going to generate an item template, and if we use the alternating item template, then it's going to alternate between the item template and the alternating item template. So if we wanted to display even rows with a different background color, we can just use the alternating item template, give it a different background color, and everything's going to work just as we want it to. The separator template is there to put some type of separator in between the item templates. Sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's not. The first template that we are going to set is going to be the header template. And we're going to display all of our data within a table. So the header template needs to have a starting point for our HTML markup. I'm going to use a table tag, and I'm not going to worry about any class names, but I will set the cell padding. I'll give that 2. Cell spacing I'll set at 0, and then the border I'll set at 1. And Visual Studio automatically gave us the closing table tag, but we don't want that in our header template. We want that in our footer template. So we'll put that there. We can also add a row for headings. So I'll add a tr element, and we'll use a th. We'll sort these by last name. So the first column will be last name, and then the second column will be first name. So now what we have here is we have a header template that has the opening table tag. It also has a table row with some header cells for the last name and the first name. And then the footer template has the closing table tag. If we were to run this and we viewed the source, we wouldn't see anything here. That's because we haven't bound any data to this control. So we'll go back to the code behind file, and we'll use the data source attribute, and for that we will use db.names, and then we want to sort these by last name. So I'm going to use the order by extension method, and then I will use an expression to sort by last name. So we're feeding a data source to our repeater now. It's going to use all the data within our names table, but it's going to order them by last name. And then finally we need to call the data bind method, and that will tell the repeater control to go and get the data from the data source and use the templates to display that information. So I'll run this again, and then we can see that the table is being generated. We have the two header fields here, and then we can look at the markup. We can see that we have the table element and then a row of header cells. So now that we have a header template and a footer template, as well as a data source for our repeater control, let's add an item template so that we can display some data from our data source. We'll add an alternating item template later, but for now we'll just focus on item template. Now the first thing we'll add is the HTML markup for our table. So we're going to add a table row, and then we'll add in 2 cells. Now we can access the data from our data source in a variety of ways. The first way uses data binding syntax, and that consists of inline code. So we use an angle bracket followed by a %sign, and then we use a pound sign right after that, and this will tell ASP.NET that we are using data binding syntax. The first way is to use the data binder class and use the eval method, and this asks for 2 things. It asks for a container, which is the data item within our data source, so it's actually going to be a name object, and to get at that we'll use the container and then data item property, and then we need to feed it an expression, and in most cases that's going to be a property name, so we could use last name here. And we can do the same thing for the first name, except we'll just change this to first name. And when we run this, we'll see that we have the last name and then the first name. However, if I'm going to be using data binding syntax, I'm not going to use the data binder class. Instead, what I do is I'll cast the data item as a name object and then use the properties directly. So in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is we have to import the namespace of our project. So we'll use the @import directive, and we'll import the template controls namespace. This is about the same thing as the using statement within C#. So we'll go back down to our data binding syntax and we'll clear out this first data binder call here, and instead what we'll do is we'll just cast container.dataItem as a name object, and then we'll use the last name property. And I will just copy and paste this. We'll change last name to first name, and when we run it we'll see that we'll get the same results. So that's 2 ways of adding data from our data source to our web page. They both use data binding syntax. The first way uses the data binder class, and the second way casts the data item as a name object and then uses the properties directly. And there is a third way to get data from our data source into our template here, and that is to use ASP.NET controls. So I'm going to change this to literal controls. I'm going to set the ID as LTL, last name, run at server, and I will do the same thing for the first name. And this approach is more in line with the idea of web forms, the idea of keeping your user interface separate from the code that drives it. So here we have just listed controls, and then we can go into our code behind and set the data for these controls. So the first thing we need to do in order to make this work is to add an event here for our repeater. And I will go over to our property pages, and we want the item data bound event. So I'll just double click. That'll automatically add a method to our code behind, and it will set the on item data bound attribute within our repeater. And the first thing that we have to do in this item data bound method is find the controls. The controls that we have listed within our markup here aren't within the page. In fact, if we try to type the control, we'll see that IntelliSense is not picking them up. That's because they are controls within the repeater, and since the repeater is dynamically built based on the templates, we're not going to find these controls within the page. So the first thing we have to do is we have to find these controls. And if you notice, let me move this over here. The second parameter for this method is repeater item event arguments. So we can use this argument here to find the item that we are currently data binding to. And this item data bound method will fire for every item within the data source. It'll also fire for the header, footer, and separator templates as well. So we have to add in some logic to make sure that we are using the correct template and adding data to the correct template. So to do that, I am going to create a literal control object. I'm going to call it LTL last name. That matches the name of the ID here used. Then I'm going to use e.item, and then I am going to use the find control method. I will pass it a string containing the name of the control, and I need to cast that as a literal control. And I will do the same thing for the first name, and I'm just going to quickly copy and paste here. So now we have the last name and the first name literal controls. Now what we need to do is we need to determine if the template that we are in has these controls, because the item data bound method will fire for every template, including the header, the footer, and the separator templates. So we need to make sure that whatever template that we are in, we have these controls here. And that's as simple as using an if statement, and we'll just use the first name, and we just want to make sure that this is a literal control. And then if it's not, then everything's fine. But if it is, then we will want a name object, and we'll use e.item again, and we'll use the data item property. And this is the same as the container.data item that we used with data binding syntax. Then we'll cast this as a name object. And then all we have to do is set the last name to name.lastname, and then LTL first name dot text equals name dot first name. And if we run this, we'll get the same exact results that we had before. So now that we have our repeater working, we have data fed to it, and we are using ASP.NET controls to do that, I am going to copy what we have here, and I'm going to add it to the alternating item template. And we don't have to worry about control names because these are in two completely different templates, so there's not going to be any naming conflict. We don't have to change any name at all. We don't even have to change our code here because they have the same ID. So the only thing that we are going to do is we will add some style here. We'll give it a background color of, let's do something FE. just so that we can get enough of a well, that's not very, you can kind of see that that's a little, let's use something more and more noticeable. We'll just use gray, and we can see that we have the item template being used with the first one, and then the alternating item template used for the second and the fourth. So all the odds are going to use the item template, all the evens are going to use the alternating item template. And we can also add in a separator template if we want. We don't necessarily need that here, but we can add it just for completeness. This will be another table row. We'll set the column span to 2. We could give it a background color, but really all I'm going to do is just set it as a no breaking space. We'll run it again so that we can see that there is a separating row between each item and item, or alternating item template. So that is data binding and template controls. The repeater control is both of these. It's a template control as well as a data bound control. There are some controls that are just template controls, and there are other controls that are just data bound controls. I use the repeater in this example because it's the easiest to use and it's the most flexible. If you want to find a particular control that can do what you want, the best way to do that is to go to the View menu and go to the Object Browser. You can scroll down to system.web namespace and then expand the system.web.ui.web controls, and then all the controls are listed here. You can also go to MSDN and look through the documentation there. A couple of controls that come to mind are the data grid and the grid view. Where is it? Yes, grid view. These are data bound controls, and I do think they do have some limited template capability. If you use the membership classes, you can use the login view control, which is a template control so that you can determine how the login pages look for the user. It's just a matter of finding what you want and using it. So that's going to wrap up this lesson of template controls and data binding, and just a brief look at Management Studio for SQL Server. Lesson 5 is going to be dealing with master pages and user controls, and then Lesson 6 is going to go right into MVC. So take care, and we'll see you next time.